a fi'n hoffi chwarae pêl-droed a coginio cacennau.
Helo, enw fi yw Steffan ac rwy'n hoffi chwarae pêl-droed ac rygbi.
Fy enw i Caitlin a rwy'n hoffi chwarae hoci a coginio.
Fy enw i yw Rodri ac rydw i'n hoffi chwarae rygbi.
Enw i Caitlin a rwy'n hoffi coginio cacennau am fy neulu i.
Fi yw Ifan a dwi gyda PKU, ble dydw i gallu bwyta protein.
Helo, fy enw i yw Tamar a mae gen i stori i chi heddi. A mae'r stori yma'n dechrau gyda bachgen o'r enw Jack. Nawr, penderfynodd Jack i deithio i ffwrdd o'i gartref i ennill ei ffortiwn. Ac yn ei boced roedd ganddo fe 3 darn o aur. Ac oedd e'n gallu teimlo'r darnau o aur yma'n clincian yn erbyn ei gilydd wrth iddo fe gerdded. Ac wrth iddo fe gerdded, dywedodd Jack wrth ei hun, "Bant a fi i ennill fy ffortiwn." Wel, cerddodd Jack. Cerddodd a cherddodd a cherddodd. Cerddodd a cherddodd a cherddodd, nes ei bod e wedi cyrraedd calon y goedwig fawr. Ac ar y llwybr o'i flaen mi welodd Jack grŵp o fachgyn. Ac oedd y grŵp o fachgyn yma gyda ffon bren, ac nhw'n defnyddio'r ffon yma i brocio rhywbeth oedd yng nghanghenau'r coed uwch eu pennau nhw. Ac wrth i Jack agosáu, mae fe'n sylweddoli taw cwch gwenyn oedd yn y coed. A bod y gwenyn wedi dod allan o'r cwch ac yn hedfan o amgylch yn wyllt gacwn yn ofnus achos oedd ei tŷ nhw ar fin cwymp ond ddeilchion ar llawr y goedwig. Wel, rhedodd Jack i fyny at y bachgen a dwedodd e, "Be chi'n meddwl chi'n neud? Gadewch y gwenyn druan i fod, be maen nhw wedi wneud i chi?" "Na," medde'r bechgyn. "Mae chwant bwyd arno ni a ni eisiau'r mêl sydd yn y cwch gwenyn." Wel, teimlodd Jack y darnau o aur yn ei boced. Mystynodd i fewn a chymerodd allan y darn o aur gyntaf a'i cynnig i'r bechgyn, "Os dwi'n rhoi hon i chi a newch chi adael y gwenyn i fod." "Iawn," medde'r bechgyn, "ni'n addo a bant â nhw gyda'r aur." A roedd Jack ar y fin cychwyn ar ei ffordd unwaith eto pan glywodd e cannoedd o leisiau bach yn dod o pen y goeden. Bzzz. Diolch. Bzzz. "Croeso," medde Jack. "Nawr, bant a fi i ennill fy ffortiwn." Y bant a fe ar ei daith. Cerddodd a cherddodd a cherddodd, cerddodd a cherddodd a cherddodd, nes ei bod yn cyrraedd pen arall y goedwig, ac ar ben arall y goedwig roedd pentre bach, ac yn sgwâr y pentre bach roedd 2 hen fenyw eistedd ar fainc. A roedd gyda'r 2 ddynes yma darn o linyn, ac ar ben arall y llinyn roedd llygoden fach llwyd, ac oedd y llygoden fach yma mewn panig llwyd yn trio redeg i ffwrdd, a phob tro oedd y llygoden ar fin dianc byse'r 2 ddynes yn tynnu pen arall y llinyn yna yn tynnu'r llygoden fach yn nhw. A gwelodd Jack hwn, rhedodd lan at y 2 ddynes a wedodd e, "Be chi'n meddwl chi'n neud? Gadewch y llygoden i fynd." "Na," medde'r 2, "sdim byd gyda ni i wneud." Teimlodd Jack yn ei boced a teimlodd nawr y 2 ddarn o aur oedd gyda fe. Ymestynnodd i fewn a chymerodd allan i'r ail darn. "Os dwi'n rhoi hon i chi, a newch chi roi'r llygoden i ni." "Iawn," medde'r 2. Felly, cymerodd Jack y llygoden, a gaeth yr llygoden i ben arall y pentref, mynd i lawr ar ei bennau gliniau a gadael y llygoden redeg i ffwrdd, ond jyst cyn i'r llygoden ddianc i fewn i'r goedwig, clywodd Jack sŵn llais bach 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 yn gwichian. "Diolch." "Croeso," medde Jack. "Nawr, bant a fi i ennill fy ffortiwn." Ond nawr dim ond 1 darn o aur oedd gyda fe, a doedd Jack ddim yn sicr o gwbl bod hi'n bosib ennill ffortiwn gyda jyst 1 darn o aur. Ond mi oedd e'n fachgen positif, felly aeth yn ei flaen. Cerddodd a cherddodd a cherddodd nes i bod e'n cyrraedd unwaith eto calon y goedwig. A dyna lle gwelodd e, ar y llwybr o'i flaen, 2 ddyn. Ac oedd y 2 ddyn yma gyda pren, ffon bren yr un, a roedden nhw'n taro rhywbeth wrth ymyl y llwybr oedd yn edrych fel twmpath mawr o fwd neu bridd. Ond wrth i Jack agosau sylweddolodd Jack, taw nid twmpath o bridd oedd hon, ond twmpath morgrig, tŷ morgrig. A gwelodd bod y morgrig wedi dod allan ac yn rhedeg o hyd y lle yn cael panig bod ei tŷ nhw ar fi'n cwmpo'n ddeolchion. Credodd Jack i fyny at y 2 ddyn a dwedodd e, "Be chi'n neud? Gadewch y morgrig i ffwrdd, be maen nhw wedi neud i chi?" "Na," medde'r 2 dyn. "Na, newn ni ddim. Sdim byd arall gyda ni i wneud." Wel, ar y pwynt yma, wrth gwrs, oedd Jack yn gwybod yn union beth i wneud. Ymystynnodd i fewn i'w boced, cymerodd allan y darn o aer olaf un oedd gyda fe. A'i gynnig i'r 2. Ac wrth gwrs, cymeron nhw'r darn a bant â nhw. Ac wrth gwrs, just cyn i Jack droi i fynd, clywodd e sŵn canoedd a'r filoedd o leisiau bach yn dweud, "Diolch, diolch, diolch." "Croeso," medde Jack. "Bant a fi i ennill fy ffortiwn." Ond sut ar y ddeiar oedd yn mynd i ennill ei ffortiwn heb dim air o gwbl. Ond mi oedd e'n fachgen positif, felly aeth ar ei ffordd. Bant a fe cerddodd a cherddodd a cherddodd nes bod e'n cyrraedd pen arall y goedwig. Ac wrth iddo fe ddod allan o'r goedwig, gwelodd Jack o'i flaen castell enfawr. Castell y brenin. A dechreuodd Jack i wenu achos chi'n gweld oedd gyda fe syniad nawr. Oedd e'n gwybod siwd oedd e'n mynd i fedru ennill ei ffortiwn, oedd e'n mynd i fynd fewn i'r castell a gofyn am swydd. A dyna be naeth e. Aeth Jack i fewn i'r castell a nath e gael ei gyflwyno i'r brenin ei hun a moes yn grymodd Jack a wedyn dwedodd Jack, "Wel, arglwydd, os gwelwch yn dda, dwi am gael swydd gennych chi, na'i brofi i chi fy mod i'n weithiwr da. Dwi am ennill fy ffortiwn." Nawr, yn anffodus i Jack, nid oedd y brenin yn ddyn neis iawn. Mi oedd e'n hoffi cael hwyl ysbryd gyda phobl eraill, ac edrychodd y brenin o amgylch ar yr holl bobl oedd yn ei lys a meddyliodd am ffordd i wneud i bawb gwenu. A dwedodd y brenin wrth Jack, "Ydy hynny'n gywir? Wel te, dwi'n mynd i roi tasg i ti. Dwi'n mynd i dy osod di yn fy nghell ddyfnach oll ar waelod y castell. Ac os wyt ti'n llwyddo dianc oddi wrth y gell, fe gei di'r holl air rwy ti'n gallu cario o'r lle yma. Ond os nad wyt ti'n llwyddo dianc, fe dora i dibynnu ffwrdd yn y bore." Sa'n siŵr, medde Jack, ond cyn iddo fe fedru weid unrhyw beth, oedd milwyr y brenin wedi dala fe a wedi mynd â fe lawr i'r gell ddyfnach oll ar waelod y castell, wedi taflu Jack i fewn a cau'r drws yn glep. Ysteddodd Jack ar lawr y gell. Ac oedd e fel, beth ar y ddeall sydd wedi digwydd i mi? Dwi ddim wedi llwyddo ennill fy ffortiwn o gwbl. Mae hwn yn ofnadwy. A y gell yma, mi oedd hi wir yn ddwfn ac yn anorchfygol. Dim clem gyda Jack sut oedd e'n mynd i ddianc oddi ar y lle yma, roedd dim ond un ffenest bach ger y nenfwd, oedd e ddim yn gallu ffitio drwy hwnna, a wedyn ar waelod y drws roedd twll bach, ond oedd dim sians bys y Jack yn gallu ffitio drwy'r twll. Sylweddolodd Jack bod e'n mynd i gael ei ben wedi torri ffwrdd. A hefyd, yn waeth na hynny, doedd e ddim hyd yn oed yn gallu meddwl oedd e wedi llwgu. Oedd e heb fwyta am oriau maith ac oedd e bron methu meddwl oedd angen bwyd arno fe gymaint. Ond, just cyn i Jack sylweddoli hwn, dyma fe'n clywed sŵn yn dod o'r ffenest. Bzzz, zzz, a thrwy'r ffenest daeth cannoedd o wenyn, a pob un gwenyn yn cario ar eu coes nhw jyst dyferyn bach o fel, a phob un ohonyn nhw'n hedfan tuag at Jack ac yn gosod y mel yn ei geg, a dyma Jack yn llyncu'r holl fel, nes ei bod yn teimlo'n iawn eto, nes ei fod yn teimlo fo bod yn gallu meddwl. Diolch, medde Jack, a hedfanodd y gwenyn i ffwrdd. A nawr bod Jack wedi bwyta, roedd e'n gallu meddwl, o nawr roedd e'n gwybod mi oedd e'n sownd yn y lle yma. Ond, jyst cyn iddo fe feddwl hynny, clywodd Jack sŵn arall. Sŵn crafu oedd yn dod o'r twll ar waelod y drws. A trwy'r twll bach daeth trwyn bach pinc, corff bach llwyd, cynffon, y llygoden fach oedd hi. Ac ar y cynffon, ynghlwm yng nghyffon y llygoden fach, roedd allwedd. Cymerodd Jack yr allwedd, ei gosod yn y drws, agorodd y drws, a roedd Jack yn y rif. Diolch, medde Jack wrth y llygoden fach, ac aeth e nôl at y brenin. Nawr, nid oedd y brenin yn hapus bod Jack wedi ymddangos awr ar ôl iddo fe gael ei gloi yn y gell yn rhydd. Ond yn anffodus, roedd pawb yn llys y brenin wedi clywed fe yn addo rhoi'r air i Jack, felly doedd dim lot o ddewis gyda'r brenin. Ond meddyliodd y brenin, roedd Jack yn fachgen bach a dim ond cwpl o bocedi oedd gyda fe, felly doedd dim lot o siams y beth oedd yn gallu cario lot o air o'r castell. Iawn, medde'r brenin, fe geidi'r holl air ti'n gallu cario o'r lle yma. Ond, yn syth iddo fe weid y geiriau yna, clywodd pawb sŵn, cannoedd ar y filoedd o draed bach yn martsio tuag at y castell, a drwy drws y castell daeth cannoedd ar y filoedd o forgrug. Pob un ohonyn nhw yn martsio un ar ôl y llall, a dyma nhw'n martsio i lawr i'r ystafell arian ble roedd yr holl air, a dyma pob un ohonyn nhw yn rhoi ar ei gefn neu ei chefn hi darn o air, a phob un ohonyn nhw yn martsio o'r lle yna. A nid oedd y brenin yn gallu gwneud unrhyw beth ond i bai am wylio wrth i'w holl air ddiflannu allan o'i gastell. A wyddwch chi beth? Roedd y brenin yna yn dlawd iawn ar ôl i'r morgrug adael gyda'i holl air. A dyna sut, o'r diwedd, enillodd Jack ei ffortiwn. Hi, my name's Tamar and I'm a storyteller, and I've got a story for you today. And it's a story about a boy called Jack. Now, like a lot of stories, Jack decided to leave home to seek his fortune. So he walked away from his home, and in his pocket he had 3 gold coins that were clinking away. And as Jack walked away from his home in search of his fortune, Jack thought to himself, "Banta fi I ennill fy fortune. Off I go to seek my fortune." Well, Jack walked and he walked and he walked and he walked. And he walked until he came to the heart of a great dark wood. And as he got into the great dark wood, he saw ahead of him on the path a group of boys. And these boys had a stick and they were poking it up into the branches of the tree up above them. And they were trying to get something out of the branches. And as Jack got closer, Jack realised that what they were trying to get out of the tree was a beehive. They were trying to knock the beehive down so they could steal the honey. And the bees were going mad. They were buzzing around frantically as their home was about to be demolished. Jack ran up to the boys and he said, "What are you doing? Leave the bees alone. They've not done anything to you." "No," said the boys. "We want the honey. We're bored and we're hungry." Jack patted his pocket and he could hear his 3 gold coins clinking. He reached inside and he took out one of his gold coins and he offered it to the boys. He said, "If I give you this gold coin, will you leave the bees alone? Will you promise not to harm them?" But the boys looked at the gold coin. "We promise," they said. So Jack gave the gold coin to the boys and off they ran. And just as Jack was about to set back off on his journey, he heard, coming from the beehive, a little voice. Not just one little voice, but hundreds of little voices that went bzzz, Diolch, bzzz, thank you. "You're welcome, croeso," said Jack. "Now, bant a fi I ennill fy fortune. Off I go to seek my fortune." And off he went. He walked and he walked and he walked and he walked. He walked and he walked and he walked and he walked. He walked and he walked and he walked and he walked until he was out of the great dark forest and he was in a little village. And in the marketplace of the village, there were two old women sitting on a bench, and Jack saw that they had on a piece of string a little grey mouse. And they were letting the mouse run away from them, and then they were tugging the string and pulling it back, and the poor little mouse was terrified. It was skittering this way and that. It was trying to escape. Well, Jack saw this, and he went up to the two women and he said, "What are you doing? What's the mouse ever done to you?" "We're bored," said the two women. "We've got nothing else to do and no money to do it with." Well, Jack could feel in his pocket, clinking against each other, the 2 gold coins he had left. He took a sigh, reached into his pocket, and took out the 2nd gold coin. Handed it to the 2 women. He said, "If I give you this, will you give me the mouse in return?" And they looked at the gold coin, and of course they agreed. And Jack took the little grey mouse, he took it to the edge of the village, he went down on his hands and knees and he let the mouse go. But just before the mouse ran into the undergrowth, Jack heard a little mousy voice go, "Diolch, thank you." "Croeso," said Jack. "Bant a fi I ennill fy fortune," and got up on his feet and went on his way. But to be honest with you, he wasn't feeling as hopeful as he had been at the beginning of the day, because now he only had 1 gold coin, and 1 gold coin did not seem like much with which to seek his fortune. But Jack walked and he walked and he walked and he walked, and he kept on walking until he was in the heart of the great dark forest again. And then ahead of him on the path, Jack saw 2 men. And these 2 men had a stick and they were poking it into what looked like a great big mound of mud, of dirt. But as Jack got closer, Jack realised that it wasn't a great big mound of mud, it was in fact an anthill. And the ants were skittering this way and that, panicking because their house was about to come tumbling down. And the 2 men were having a grand old time, hitting the anthill over and over again to try and make it fall over. "What are you doing?" said Jack. "Leave the ants alone. What have they ever done to you?" "No," said the 2 men. Now Jack, he knew what to do by now. He reached into his pocket and he took out his final gold coin, the last one that he had left. And he held it out to the 2 men. He said, "If I give you this, do you promise to leave the ants alone?" And the 2 men, of course they promised. And they took the gold coin and off they went. And Jack was about to turn to go when he heard thousands upon thousands of little anty voices. "Diolch, thank you." "Croeso," said Jack. "Bant a fi I ennill fy fortune." Except Jack really wasn't sure that he was going to be able to get his fortune now. He had no money at all. And even Jack, who was an optimistic lad, knew that you need a bit of money if you're going to seek your fortune. But he kept on walking. He walked and he walked and he walked and he walked. He walked until he got to the very other side of the great dark forest. And there in front of him, Jack saw a castle. None other than the king's castle. And Jack thought to himself, "Yes, this is perfect. This is exactly the kind of place I need to be in order to seek my fortune. I'm going to go into the castle and I'm going to ask the king to give me a job, and then he'll see that I'm a good lad and a good worker." and I'll work my way up, and that's how I'll gain my fortune." So Jack did just that. He went into the castle, he asked to be presented to the king. He stood before the king and he said, "My name is Jack and I would like a job." Now, unfortunately for Jack, the king of this land was not a nice man. And he was also quite bored, and he'd been looking for some amusement. And the king looked around at all his courtiers, and he thought of a way to amuse them. And he said to Jack, "I tell you what, I'm going to make a bet with you. I'm going to bet that you can't get yourself out of my deepest, darkest dungeon. I'm going to throw you in there right now. And if you can get yourself out, then I shall give you all the gold that you can carry from this castle. But if you can't get out, tomorrow morning I will cut off your head." And Jack opened his mouth to say that didn't seem like a very good bet, but before he could speak, he was being grabbed by 2 of the king's soldiers, who hurried him down the stairs, down to the very bottom of the castle, and threw him into the deepest, darkest dungeon, shutting the door bang behind him. And Jack sat on the damp, stony floor, and he realised that this was about as far from seeking his fortune as he could possibly get. And he looked around him and he realised that this dungeon was truly awful. It was all damp and dark and mouldy, and there was just the tiniest little crack of a window up at the very top. There was no way he was going to be able to get out of there. And the door of the dungeon was thick and strong, and it had been locked by a key, and there was just the tiniest hole at the very bottom, and there was no way he was going to be able to get out through there. And what was worse than all of this was that Jack had not eaten for hours and hours and hours, and he was so hungry he could barely think. Well, in that moment, just as Jack felt despair settling on him, just as he felt horror claiming him, he heard a sound. Bzzz, bzzz. Sound of thousands and thousands of little voices, and then through that little tiny window came streaming thousands upon thousands of bees, and each and every one of them was carrying on their leg a little droplet of honey. And they all flew, and they flew around Jack's head, and they dropped the droplet of honey into his mouth one at a time, and Jack swallowed up all that honey until he was finally full. And then when his belly was full, Jack could think again. And Jack, he thought hard, and he waved goodbye to the bees. The bees flew away through the window, and he thought to himself, how can I get out? How can I get myself out of this mess? And of course, it was then that Jack realised there was no way. He was never going to be able to get himself out of this dungeon. But just as he thought this, just as despair began to settle on him again, Jack heard a little scratching sound. And it was coming from under the door. And then through that tiny little hole at the bottom of the door came a little pink nose, followed by a grey body, followed by a tail. It was the mouse. And in the mouse's tail was a key. Jack fell upon the key. He said, "Thank you, Diolch." He took the key, he put it in the lock, and it clicked, and the door swung open. And Jack was free. He'd done it. Well, the king of the land was not too happy when Jack presented himself once more before him just a few hours after he'd been locked in that deepest, darkest dungeon. And unfortunately, the king had made his pronouncement in front of all of his courtiers, so he could not back down. But he did console himself that Jack was quite a skinny lad, and he only had a few pockets, and there was no way he was going to be able to carry that much gold from the castle. Because the king, you see, had a lot of gold, and he did not want to share it with anybody else. So he said to Jack, "Well, go on then. Go on then, I am a man of my word. You can take all the gold you can carry from this place." But just as the king spoke those words, everybody in the castle heard the same sound the sound of thousands of little feet marching in unison, and into the king's castle marched thousands upon thousands of ants. And they marched down to the king's counting house, and each of them put on his back or her back a gold coin, and they marched out of there. And all the king could do was sit and watch as his gold got marched out of his castle right under his nose by streams and streams of ants. And they left the king as poor as a church mouse. And that was how Jack sought and won his fortune with the help of the faithful animals.